So the clock is ticking. This is a session about time. I don't know if André and I necessarily are great believers in punctuality, but this festival is. So we're going to be punctual.
It's about time.
It's about time. And we're going to, I am listed as the moderator, but we're going to dispense with moderation, I hope, actually.
Yeah, oh, that's bad. Okay.
We're going to be excessive. No, and we're going to just have a conversation, but I'll start by introducing myself and André. My name is Judith Shulevitz. I'm kind of a journalistic Jill of all trades. I've written about literature, religion. Currently, I'm writing about, my children call me the correspondent on campus rape because I've recently written a series of pieces about that. But the reason I think we're doing this panel is I wrote a book about the Sabbath called The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time. So it was a study kind of the sociology of time and religion, and a whole lot more, I hope. But that's kind of where I'm coming from. André is a memoirist, a novelist. I'm going to slightly borrow from this just to make sure I get it all right. He wrote a memoir of his boyhood in Alexandria, and he is a scholar of 17th century literature. And he's written a great deal about Proust, which is possibly why he's on this panel.
Irrelevant.
Okay, we're not going to talk about Proust. Maybe we will. You can look in here for the extensive list of where his work, his periodical work has appeared. And of course, his most recent novel, can be found on the table outside in the hall, wherever that is. I wanted to start on a personal note. We talk in the little write-up. We talk about how time has speeded up and changed, and I thought as André is a great chronicler of the inner experience of time. Perhaps I could get you to talk about how time has changed for you personally from your boyhood in Alexandria to your, whenever that was, to your manhood in New York City in the 21st century.
Okay, that's an easy one in 2 seconds. No, the way that one defines one, I mean, we all have experiences of time that are very different one from the other. But we can all more or less agree that there's something happened in our lives at some point that altered us from whoever we were supposed to become, or who we thought we were going to become. It could be adolescence, it could be puberty, it could be a shock or whatever, but we all have a marker somewhere in the past that defines us, that sort of unhinged us and forced us to redefine ourselves. And in my case, it's very simple. It's almost palpable because you know it. It happened in May of 1965. I was kicked out of Egypt. My life was never the same ever after. So that's a simple one. I always go back to that date because I know that something in me was forever changed. I had to reinvent myself. We all have, in many ways, reinvented ourselves. So that belongs to the past, and I've always written about the past. And in fact, I can't even write anything unless it's from the perspective of time, the perspective of something that has happened in another dimension. What interests me about time and why we're here is because we both have a sense of time as being very similar. We have similar concepts of what time is, and yet we've experienced time in very different ways. And I think all of our children, and in some cases our grandchildren, have also very different and a kind of fundamental impatience with the markers of time. One of the things that interests me as a writer, because this is why I'm here, because I'm a writer, is that I believe, and I'm going to quote a sentence that I always write in almost everything I've written, and it's embarrassing because I'm interested in a dimension of it's called the irrealis mood. I mention the irrealis mood wherever I go. It's the might have been that hasn't really happened, but isn't unreal for not happening, and might still happen, though we hope it doesn't, or we hope it does. Okay, it's that particular dimension. And the reason why we're together here is because we both understand that a fundamental displacement in time occurs in an individual or in an entire community, in an entire history of a people, that forces it to redefine its relationship with time. Am I correct so far? And
yeah.
Okay. Don't disagree with me yet. Okay.
No, I'm not yet.
But I do think that one of the sentences in your book that really struck home is that the quotation you gave of Heschel, calling sort of the history of the Jewish people is that it has created a cathedral in time. The only nation that I know of, I'm sure there are others, that has not created a cathedral in place or in a particular space, because in a sense it has arrogated the right to place until 1948.
Or it arrogated the right to place in 1948.
Right.
You might say. So Judaism, of course, did have a cathedral.
Yes.
It was the temple. Then the temple was destroyed, and Jews started to enshrine sacredness in time, in the Sabbath. That was sort of the point of my book. But one of the controversies actually about Heschel's quote is that it came after the founding of the State of Israel.
Oh.
And there are those ardent Zionists who believe that he was not sufficiently on board with the founding of the State of Israel, because he was saying Judaism is a religion that's about time, not about space. He said it's a cathedral in time, not in space. So Judaism is about time, not space. But those who were busily founding the State of Israel were like, well, wait a minute, it's a place too at this point, and we have to be behind it. And of course, that was, back then there were a lot of quite religious Jews who were actually opposed to the founding of the State of Israel, because
they still are.
Right, a smaller and smaller number of them, I would say. But yeah, so anyway, that is I do agree with you, except I think that when you said arrogating the privilege of time, it's almost as though we've now re-arrogated the privilege of space.
Now we have space. In fact, many sayings do suggest that this happened at one time and now it's happening in this place. And that's okay. But we both have this sense, I think it's a discomfort with time. Most of us, when we want to be adults, especially vis-a-vis children, will say to children, this happened in the past, we're now living in the present. I am living in the moment. I've heard many people tell me, stop being in the past so much. It's not that I like the past, but that I drift into it. And one of the things that I find interesting in the past is that in the past, I used to have a vision of what the future was going to be. And that vision of the future never left. It just never happened. So I live with a vision of the future that is unreal. But it does define my life and what I want out of my life. So clearly I'm dealing with the future, but I'm also dealing with what is known as the future anterior, something that could have been and that continues to resonate and to percolate in the future. But it does the same thing in the past. And I was going to read a quotation, but I won't, from Austerlitz. I don't know how many of you have read the book Austerlitz. It's a novel by Sebald, yes. And in it, he questions Newton's idea of time and saying, if it's a river, where does the river start and where does it go? And how about the banks of the river, the banks of time, okay, if you're going to use metaphors for time. So even our metaphors for time are totally sort of unsatisfactory. We don't know what time is. And even when we live time or when we even write about time, we are still fumbling along. And this brings me to the subject of the modern appreciation of time, sort of how we started this whole thing.
Right. I in my book, I talk about how I actually think we're in a moment where we're shifting from mechanical time to what I would call mobile time, which is actually softer around the edges. So our public time, the idea of public time, some historians of time say, go back to the moment when they started putting clocks on the top of towers in town halls. And so everybody calibrated themselves to that time, and everybody was finally calibrated more or less on the same time. And then it goes through railroads and telegraphs, which really sharpened our notion of time. And so public time became something we all shared, right? And it had fixed dates. Something started at such and such a time. One of the shocking things about this session is it actually started at 2:30, right? Things started at hard and fast times. But I don't know anybody in the age of the personal mobile device who actually really has a hard and fast sense of time. In other words, we never really meet anybody at exactly 2:30. We endlessly text, at least my children don't. Let's put it that way. We endlessly text back and forth, well, I'm going to be 5 minutes late. I'm having a problem with traffic. Can we make it 2:45? Very few things now, except the really super public ones, start at a punctual time. School starts when the bell rings. But fewer and fewer things have this hard and fast. Time is much easier to negotiate. So I do think my kids' generation has less of a sort of clear sense of time. Also, their days are dominated by these devices. They really, really are, and they're very addictive in that you lose time in them in a way that I and you probably used to lose time in a book.
It used to be called wasting time.
I know, true. But they never have to be bored. They can just be on this thing endlessly and endlessly and endlessly. So they can waste time. I feel like they waste more time. That's probably because I'm a mother now and not a teenager anymore. But I want to go back to this Irrealis, this tempus Irrealis, which is, I think, was not your phrase for it. But it's the what might have been sounds to me like an idea of art, or at least an idea of the novel, an idea of the imagination. It's almost as though that's a kind of credo of the time in which you create, or what it is you create.
But isn't it? I mean, there's a wonderful line by Machiavelli, and I love Machiavelli. I don't know if you like Machiavelli. I adore him. He's really a brilliant man. He says, "I don't want to have. I don't mind having guilt feeling. Repentance is fine. I don't want regret." In other words, regret is when you could have done something but you didn't. Repentance is when you did it and now you're sorry you did. Okay, and so when you think about it, these are two. I mean, he by the way, he steals the idea from another Italian writer. But the problem is that he has these two markers: regret and repentance. And I have another one, which, it's between ritual, which is a repetition of something that has already happened, and rehearsal, which is the repetition of something that you want to see happen. So we all have ways of defining this thing which we shall call time in such a way that it allows us to locate ourselves in a rather articulable, formulatable moment. In other words, I want to know, where do I stand between repentance and regret? Because I know that somewhere along this caliber, there is something of me in there.
Do you know that there's actually an interesting psychologist who argues that we have more regret now than we ever did?
Why? Because
it's in a wonderful book called The Paradox of Choice. His name is Barry Schwartz. And he argues that with the proliferation of choice, we experience more what's called consumer's remorse, but it's not really remorse. Except insofar as remorse comes from the word, a Latin word, which means to bite back, or we are bitten by regret for our consumer choices. But he argues with the proliferation of choices in society, not just of which of the 45 different brand extensions of Special K we should buy, but which various career paths we should do, and since nothing is hard and fixed anymore, everything's transactional. Should we switch from this career to that career? Should we have swiped on that person in Tinder and called that person on Tinder and not the one that came 3 pictures before? So he argues that there's actually quantifiably more regret in the world than there used to be. What do you think of that?
Well, I probably, since we have more choices, then we have more possibilities for regret. And think of the repentance that comes when you've made the wrong choice and you want to dump the wrong choice, or however or you want to sort of exit. But these are all situations they all exist for me in time. And it is true that the literary sensibility cultivates those domains because they're so amorphous that one can sort of try to excavate them. And which brings me to another idea about how much time do we have?
We have shockingly little time. So speak quickly.
I'm speaking very quickly because the whole idea for me of time came from a reading I did of Freud. And it comes from a moment in which Freud says, we are like the city of Rome. We have like the layers of prehistoric Rome, the Republican Rome, the Imperial Rome, the whatever it is, the Renaissance, medieval, Baroque Rome. All these Romes, they're all in us. And we have all these timescapes sort of forged into ourselves. And in a sense, all these tectonic plates of time, they're not fixed. They move. So you have sort of Renaissance Rome meeting Republican Rome. In a second, it could happen. And in our lives, it happens the same way. Our childhood comes back to us in a dream. That dream percolates for the whole day. And suddenly, at the age of 60, you find yourself feeling like a child because of the memory that you had.
Can you pinpoint that in a piece of writing, in your memoir, in a novel? How does this play out in your writing?
In my writing?
Yeah.
Oh, now you're forcing me to remember and go back in time.
Yes, I am. Sorry.
It's very hard. I mean, it always goes back. For me, the easiest one is to go back to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something that happens in Egypt that I learned a lesson about life, about people, and that then I re-excavate it and I use it. For example, the simplest one is the taste of food. Okay, the taste of food. You don't remember the taste of food, as Proust would teach us. It has to come to you, usually inadvertently, when you're least prepared for it. So suddenly you find that you remember the precise taste of a particular kind of, let's say, chicken that was cooked by so and so in such a way that you've never eaten again because it comes back to you. Now, when I was writing my memoir Out of Egypt, it's not that I remembered the taste of that chicken and sort of described it as accurately as I could. It's that I had already remembered it at some point in Italy. And then I took that memory in New York when I was writing my book 20 years later to take me back to Egypt. So it is these, we have like sediments of memories that as a writer you sort of ford and or what's the word I'm looking, you plumb for those memories. And that's what I did as a writer. But I live in that zone, and I think we all do. I wouldn't be speaking to you about this if I wasn't convinced that we all have this experience of time inscribed in us, each one as different as the other. And I wanted to, do we have time?
Yeah, I think we do. We have a few minutes.
We have a few minutes. I wanted to read something you wrote because it reminded me very much of Freud and what you're doing in there in a different way. You're not discussing time, but you're discussing the Sabbath. And I want you all to pay attention to how it's written, okay? It is my theory that these ambivalences about the Sabbath can be traced in some way to the Christian ambivalence towards the Sabbath, which can be traced in some way to a deeper ambivalence towards the idea of living a life enthralled to law and tradition, which can be traced in some way to an even deeper ambivalence towards ritual, which can be traced in some way to the most profound possible qualms about holiness, an uncanny spectral quality that forces itself upon us from its perch in the past. What Judith was doing in that beautiful passage is that she was, and you might want to explain this, she was basically excavating, which is a word I've been using all the time because of the Schliemann metaphor. Schliemann who digs for Troy and then discovers that there are 7 layers in Troy. And by the time he's at the 8th, he thinks that the 5th was the real Troy I was after. What did I do? And you're doing the same thing. You're doing what Freud was doing. You're excavating and digging deeper and deeper and deeper because you're going back in time. Do you want to comment?
I didn't actually. I don't actually think of myself exact. I mean, yes, I go back in time. Although oddly, I go from Jewish to Christian, which is sort of temporally off. And I'm going back to this idea of the holy, which I think pervades our lives even now. But I think what I was actually going back to is going through layers of things that are increasingly repugnant, actually. So you're going from, the Sabbath, which we all think of as just simply quite boring, to law and tradition, which many of us think is simply must be disrupted and done away with, to the holy, which we all think of as something that has vanished from our lives, right? We now live in a non-sacred time. It's been that illusion has been dispelled. We live in the disenchanted era. So I wanted to sort of go back and say, look, all of this is still in our lives, whether we admit to enchantment or not.
Right.
It's in our lives. And my theory of ritual in that book is that what appeals to me about the Sabbath is this idea that it happens punctually at sundown. That's it. You didn't get the candles lit, you're screwed. It's over for you. Don't light them now. It's done. That's it. You know, and what I like about Judaism is it brings these laws in from outside and forces you to adhere to them, which I think probably most people in this room probably don't do if they're Jewish. But I live in this consciousness of what it is I'm not doing. The candles I'm not lighting on time.
Oh, regret and remorse.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And I'm very fascinated by that and how these rituals come out of the past and sort of say, you're not doing it, and you live in that consciousness of not doing it. Or you are doing it, and as you do it, you learn what the past had to teach you, right? It comes out of the past and teaches you. But I guess I thought what I was doing in that passage was going down to something very primal and very unacceptable in our time, which is the sacred.
The holy, the idea of the holy.
The idea of the holy.
And I mean, when you think about it, most people, and I know the word is very common nowadays, it's the idea of the spiritual. We lead spiritual lives to mean we believe in ESP or some kind of weird thing. But actually, the real essence of spiritual is to encounter, you should use the word enchantment, the word of the holy. We have holiness around us. And I'm the most irreligious, the most lapsed Jewish person you'll ever meet. But I do believe that there's something holy in our experience of, particularly of time, that touches us. And when we can access that moment of enchantment, it's as if suddenly our lives have an aura, at least for a little while, because we've entered this cathedral of time.
Do you think that your children experience time differently from you?
I think so.
How so?
Because they're more in the here and now, and I think the mobile universe that we live in now forces the here and now in our lives. As you said, if you get a text, an email you don't have to reply to right away. You are away from your computer. But a text, it's with you. If you didn't answer the text right away, it's because you chose not to.
Well, I think there's a hierarchy. I think you're allowed a day with
Oh,
email,
no.
and you're allowed about an hour with text.
Yeah.
Is that right?
An hour at most.
And among my children, 5 minutes is a lot. They're like, they each know that the other has the phone on their person,
Right.
and what is the deal with not answering.
Right. And so the here and now, even though I make fun of it, because we all live in the here and now, in the present, because we're sort of given to life as it's given to us, as we learn from all kinds of psychologists, it's to be in the present. Actually, we're not.
How about from your father? How is your experience of time different from your father's?
My father has the same one as I did. Actually, he was more in the here and now than I am. He was a very present person. But you see, even the word nostalgia, which I find really annoying, because I'm known now, you can find near my name is André Aciman, nostalgist. As if, what is it? I'm not a nostalgist, but basically I drift to the past almost instinctively. And my father was not that way.
I see. But you live, I'm sort of trying to force you to find some distinction between growing up in Egypt and living in New York in 2015. But perhaps that isn't a relevant.
You think it would be any different for somebody who was born, say, in the Bronx and moved to Manhattan than from somebody who was born in Egypt and moved to Manhattan?
Well, I was born in Detroit and ended up in Manhattan through a very circuitous route. So I think in some weird way.
You're as displaced as I am.
I am, but I come from the land of tailorization, right? I came from the land of the automobile industry.
Okay.
So not that, my dad, my folks worked in the automobile industry, but they worked in a satellite industry, laundry, the schmata business.
My father was in cotton, okay?
Well, there you go. So we have that in common too. And, of course, that was subject to these to the times of industry, to the assembly line,
right?
The line, the
Oh,
time of the assembly line. Okay. That's where I'm going with this. And now I live in Manhattan, where I think things are. So in a way, what I was doing is going from a company town to Manhattan, where everybody operates on their own individual schedule. No one is coordinated.
No.
Everyone's asynchronous. Everyone's on a different schedule. And in a way, I actually think that is the journey we've been making in this country. which is from a unified public time of industrial production, et cetera, to, the post-industrial information age, where nobody's on the same schedule, nobody is together, which is another reason that the Sabbath appealed to me, because there was this incredibly retrograde idea that we all had to be together for 25, well, not 25 hours, but for a certain period of time every day, every week, which is so, anachronistic.
It is anachronistic. It's almost, in my family, it's unacceptable.
Yeah.
You cannot force somebody to be in the same place at the same time.
Well, in my family, that would also be, you don't want to spend Sabbath with your family. You have to spend it with,
With friends.
Yeah, with friends.
It's a good excuse. Anyway, I think that we might have some questions.
Yes.
No. There you go. Thank you. Unfortunately, I spent some time at Mount Sinai Hospital a couple weeks ago and saw the Sabbath elevator.
Yes.
And a rabbi friend of mine explained to me what that was all about, and that the Jewish Sabbath you spend is God's time. It's not your time. It's a different way of viewing the Sabbath as opposed to the Christian way of viewing the Sabbath. That's a day that you take off and you really enjoy it's the present that's really important, which is, of course, behind Buddhism and meditation and everything. Being in the present is what really is the only time that we have.
Right.
And how important that is, and how these devices that we have and screens and everything are really robbing us of that time, which is really the only time that we have. So.
Well, I mean, you were in a hospital, so the concept of time as
it's a different time.
Right, as a
like
resource
legal
not
time.
to be squandered, I think becomes very real to people in hospitals.
Right.
But actually, so Judaism does have there's a philosopher who writes about, and there are passages from the Talmud that talk about the Sabbath as a kind of tithing. It's not 1/10, it's 1/7, but you're tithing your time, and that's exactly right. You're giving it to God. It is God's time. But I would say the Christian idea, what most people don't realize about the Sabbath is we are living, in fact, we're in New England, which was the most Sabbatarian part of the most Sabbatarian nation in history, right? We were Sabbatarian in this country for hundreds of years, so at least 150, to at least 200 years, before the country was founded, if you include before the country was founded. Longer than the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel has existed. So, and we were very, it's never known, it's not known. Biblical historians do not know how well, the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Jews actually kept the Sabbath. Because a lot of what was written was very sort of notional, it was law, it wasn't, thick ethnographic description. So we don't know how well the Sabbath was actually kept in the ancient world. And in this country, we have more records, and we know that it was really strict in a lot of states. And it was God's time. And then this kind of notion, when I go around and talk about my book in churches, which I love to do, because a lot of the book is about Christianity. It's not just a Jewish book. And Christians really know their Bible. It's really fun. But there's this notion in Christian circles that are rediscovering the Sabbath, that you can have Sabbath anytime. In fact, somebody told me about a little thing that at Christian conferences, somebody was given these do not disturb signs to hang on their door, and it said, Sabbath happening. And you'd put it on your door, and you'd take an hour off, and you'd put it on your door, and it said, Sabbath happening. And that is a notion of when I am stopping is when I am stopping. And it is very here and now, and it's also very individualized. And my idea is that what we are losing in this country is this notion of communal time when all of us slough off, the pressures of the work schedule at the same time and sort of interact with each other for good or for ill. And I actually talk in my book about how unpleasant the Sabbath used to be in my family, We didn't want to be in the same room together, my God. But that is a notion of time that I think we're losing, and it is somewhat to screen. So any other questions? Yes.
What do you think the relationship is between our current attitude towards time and the more recent penchant to memorialize?
That's a good question for you, André.
To memorialize is nice because it means that to memorialize means to make memories. of a particular event, of a particular person. In other words, we're saying, I am remembering today to memorialize you forever. In other words, next year, I will remember that I said I was going to remember you, or the event. And it's not the same, it's like a monument, except that in a monument, you just see the monument memorializing a particular battle, a particular death, or whatever. But in memorialization, which is a very complex word, the real event that you want to capture is the day when you decided to memorialize this. In other words, next year, I want to remember that I made a plan to remember this moment. It's a way in which people who are really sort of nomadic form, they artificially graft themselves on this planet by grafting themselves in time.
So you're saying you never really remember anything, you remember the moment you decided to remember it.
Well, you have memories, but when you memorialize it, you want to formalize the memory. And at that moment, what you're saying is, I want to remember that in 2015, I promised to remember this. And now we're in 2020. And God, 5 years, 5 long years with the weight of 5, whatever it is, have passed. And I am still remembering this. And it's a different thing than just saying, gee, you know, I just happened to eat a piece of Madeleine and I'm recalling my childhood. Different things.
I wonder if there isn't a kind of falsehood in some of this memorialization, though. We all know people tie ribbons to trees, they put paper flowers on power poles. To me, this is a phony kind of memorialization, and I think it's confusing. Something much more important that we should be doing is taking note of what really did happen rather than just showing the flag.
Well, I mean, it's a complex thing that you're saying. It might be frivolous, I agree, but for some people, I mean, there are people who put a ribbon around a tree because it's all they can do. There's nothing left to do. And so you borrow this gesture that has now become a kind of hallmark card moment, you know, where you tie a ribbon around the tree, and it makes you feel as if you've really accessed some dimension that you didn't have access to. And the most sort of trivialized moment I feel, and it's totally me feeling it because it will offend some of you, is the Washington Memorial for the Dead of Vietnam, where people go and they have to touch the name and they start to suddenly erupt into tears. It's almost like a ritualized thing. When you go there, you're supposed to touch the name with a piece of cloth or the flag, and then you start crying. Now, it's no different than tying a ribbon around a tree, except that in both cases, the individual performing the gesture feels that this is all I can do, and it means something to me to be doing this, and I'm accessing almost like sort of an immortal dimension, and it lasts a second.
So you're saying ritual, tying a ribbon around the tree is a ritual. It's an American ritual.
Yeah, it's
going to the Vietnam Memorial is a ritual, and ritual allows you to channel emotions and memories, right? Time. And we're always going to have, I mean, that's sort of one of my pet peeves is people think we're in a post-ritual age. We're always going to have rituals. They're just not going to necessarily be the rituals we were taught about in Sunday school.
No,
or whatever.
and in fact, most of us make up our own rituals, but those you're ashamed of admitting because they're embarrassing.
Right.
Okay, those are the really shameful, superstitious things that you do in order to ward off whatever it is that you're scared of. We don't admit those, okay?
Yes.
Since you've written this book on the Sabbath, I look forward to reading it. I'd like to ask you, we are Sabbath observers in our home. Why didn't you like being on Sabbath?
Are we talking about the Jewish Sabbath?
Yeah.
Okay. So your Shomer Shabbat. Your Shomer Shabbat.
I'm sorry?
I think we might need a mic somewhere. Here.
I got it. Oh, Peach.
Or just if you could summarize it quickly.
I wanted Judith to tell us why she didn't like being at her family Shabbat table.
Oh, that's easy. Except you
It's
have
supposed to be a joyous, holy
Yeah,
night of
absolutely.
fun at home.
That's a lot of pressure, don't you think? Especially when your family's not getting along all that well. No, I mean there's a more formal reason which I go into in the book, which is as happens in many families, my mother and my father didn't have exactly overlapping ideas of what should happen in the home on a religious occasion. So my mother was filled with resentment. My father was irritated. They didn't actually fight. They just got very quiet. And so there was this whole, I associated the Sabbath hush, which I actually, with something very angry and charged. And in fact, I do keep the Sabbath in my own way. We're quasi-Shomer Shabbat, where we send the kids to a Jewish day school, so they know all about it. But I just pack it full of people. We have a lot of people over for Shabbos dinner. We go to shul, and frankly, I tend to be the one who sits in the back and schmoozes more than prays. And we try to have some big Shabbos lunch. Then we all go to the park. All the parents with their kids go to the park. And then finally, we go home and wait, till Havdalah. And my kids are just like, when can the TV go back on? So for me, it's very loud and boisterous, right? But when I was growing up, it was not loud and boisterous.
And it was very social. You've made yours very social.
Very social.
And generational.
And multi-generational, absolutely. But one thing that happens, and I talk about this, so I talk about the Sabbath as almost a machine for creating community, right? So there are some certain steps I go through. But basically what you've done is you've created an opportunity for communal interaction or family interaction. And let's just say that if your family has some dysfunction, that's not always a good thing, So that's.
Thank you.
This gentleman had a question.
So one of the
Okay, we'll take you next.
one of the things that's changed about the way we create memorials is the fact that we have cell phones ubiquitously recording. And so what was memorial, which was in my memory, is now, I now have a photograph. I now have the actual reality. I have tokens. I mean, I have collections of badges from conferences that you wouldn't believe. And the only reason to keep the badge is to remember the conference, right? But now I have photographs. And so my wonderful memory of that sunset is no longer a wonderful memory of the sunset, which was much, much better in my memory than when I actually look at the photo and see all the clouds that were there. How is that going to change in the future as this generation, particularly the younger generation now, is memorializing or at least saving everything in a visual way?
I think it's not going to be any different. I mean, we've had photographs for the past 150 years.
Very few.
And no, but people do. There are families that take pictures all the time. I come from such a family on my wife's side, not on mine. Okay, her father is constantly taking pictures, so he has this amazing catalog of pictures. I don't think they substitute for memory. I don't think so. I think I'm grateful for pictures. The more pictures there are, the more I can corroborate what really happened. It's not that what goes on in my head goes on in my head. It's like having my grandmother cook, and if she were alive, I would love to have the food that she cooked, okay? And having somebody else cook it and produce the same one, and every week if I wanted it, is not the same thing as this thing that I remember. Even though the one that has been recently cooked, it could be much better than the one she cooked. But it doesn't matter. It's what's in my mind is in my mind forever. What's on paper, what's on screen, is never going to compete with what's in the mind. I don't think there's ever going to be a danger of that.
Wow, I'm jealous. Because I would say, I'm going to disagree with you. Finally, we have a point of disagreement. For me, it absolutely does supplant. The photograph does supplant the memory to a certain degree, though I think it was ever thus. I think whatever form of representation we had has always somehow supplanted our memories. But one thing that fascinates me, because I'm actually in the process of sorting through, my parents, rather shockingly, decided to throw out thousands of slides. And I said, oh no, that's not happening. I'm taking them. And then I took them and I said, I'm going to sort them and I'm going to get them digitized. And then I realized, oh, I understand now why they wanted to throw them all out. Oh my God, what have I done? But I'm looking at these old photographs, of my childhood, and I'm fascinated by how directly the colors of the Kodachrome, like the song Kodachrome, but the colors of the different film stock correspond, that are pegged to a certain time era, right? Correspond to my sense of the color. So I was born in Detroit, lived the first 5 years of my life in Detroit. And I remember Detroit as being filled with this kind of red brick that was of a certain tonality And I look at it and I think, and I suddenly, just the other day, I was thinking, red brick can look like anything, depending on what kind of sun is hitting it. But I always associate it with the red brick from those photographs from the 60s, right? And then there's also the convention, right? The way everybody stood so stiffly in the 60s in those photographs, and now everybody is like, but I look at my niece's Facebook page, and the way she poses with her friends is the way everyone else of her age is posing with their friends. And they're all looking like they're having a fabulous time on the beach, or whatever it is. And it's just like it's this show. They're showing, it's the Facebook self-presentation. So there's not only colors, but there's these tropes for folk taking pictures and for memorializing. And that's why I think it was ever that. Like if we wrote diaries, when we wrote diaries in a particular way, a vernacular that we learned from our peers or our parents. When we wrote, whatever it is we use to memorialize, it is ritualized, it is cliched. I mean, a cliche is a photograph, right? So, and it does shape the way we remember the past, but it's not like there's something different. It's all ever that, whatever the form of memorialization was.
Maybe.
I'm just saying you have a better memory than me.
So, coming back to sort of the technology, my experience in the last 10 years or whatever is that we live in the hyper-present, as you say, but we're not present. And it creates a sense of anxiety with me, for me personally, and seeing my kids. And I wonder how you would reflect on what do we do to get over that anxiety? Is it rituals? Is it memorialization? How do we escape this living in the present where we're not present?
Which of us? Both of us or whoever? How do we escape? Can we ever escape living in the present? But not being present.
But
that's why everybody's meditating.
I don't think anybody was ever in the present. It's a joke. It's not true. It never happened. We don't know how to be in the present. We'd be much happier if we were in the present. I don't think, for example, let's take the lunch we all had today, okay? There was the dessert, the best morsel, okay? How many of you left it for the end? To have the best part of the whatever it is that you were eating, you want it to the end. As opposed to somebody who's in the present is going to eat the best moment, the best piece of the lunch. You want to have it now. But no, you left it for a bit later. Well, not totally later because I don't want it to wait too long, okay? But you never have it at the moment. And I think the real sense of anxiety is that we now know and we accept the fact that we are dysfunctionally in the present. We know that, and we think it's the wrong thing to do. But I don't think it is. I wouldn't know who to be if I had to be in the present all the time. I don't know what that means.
I think I'm going to take another stab at that and talk about co-presence. So one of the things that it characterizes our communication now, we're talking about text messages and emails, is this notion of asynchronous communication. We don't communicate in real time anymore. We communicate in staggered time, and we communicate via FaceTime, right? And it's almost as good, right? Skype. We don't. Less and less are we worried about the idea of being physically in the proximity of someone else. And there's all this work that's been done, interesting neuroscience that's been done about the physical effect that being in somebody's actual company has on you. Your pulse rate starts to coincide. If people live with each other, particularly women, this has been, of course, much talked about, you have pheromonal coordination. And your menses start to correspond. But just even in a more transient way, you can pick up on someone's vibe, you can calm down, you can get agitated, right? These things, people affect one another at a very deep bodily level. And for me, I'm only really present when I'm present with someone. And maybe this goes back to this whole obsessively social Sabbath, right? I just, if someone isn't there to share the moment for me, it is harder for me to believe in its reality. And we're less and less co-present, I believe. So that is one way in which the present is eluding us, I would argue.
You've touched on two things that are fascinating to me. One is, yes, I also have scanned all my life's photos. I'm 68 now, and it was an amazing experience. But you made me wonder, as you did it, whether, when you were talking about it, whether in this world where we now only take digital photos, we
Right.
don't print things out,
Yeah.
everything is digital, whether we actually lose something because we never actually really go back to go back and look at all this world of experiences that we've put on these photos, because they are in the digital cloud, and there's no reason. You're always looking forward, you're already taking, but you're never really looking back, which actually the act of going back and going through all those 35 millimeter things forces you to do, and actually.
Yeah. I mean, that's a real concern. That's actually like a huge archivist concern, right? Is how are we going to access all those digital files that were created for a set of computers and a kind of software we no longer have, right? So I used to edit a magazine called Lingua Franca, and we did a whole big piece about the crisis at the archive, U.S. archives, because they can't get the parts for the computers that they need to run the software to get to the information that, and they're losing whole generations of
we as
information.
individuals are in that.
And we're in the same situation. I can't access my college thesis. I don't know. I know I printed it out somewhere, but I have the discs. Remember those floppy disks, those little hard floppy disks?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I'm never going to see that again. So
that's the first thing I want to
Okay.
I just want a couple of things I want to throw out. Second is this point you just raised about being in the presence. And technology has done that, changed that as well, because now, I mean, my daughter lived in Washington for a number of years, and I spoke to her all the time on the phone. Now she lives in Berlin. I Skype her, and it's as if she is present, whereas she wasn't present.
See, I always preferred phone conversations because you don't have to look at people. It's like being in a shrink's office, right? You don't have to look at the person's face, so you can like really be there with them because you're not actually there with them. You're lost in your. Do you remember those long conversations we used to have that had no point? Remember those long phone conversations that just had no point whatsoever? They were so fun. Never have those anymore.
So wouldn't you contrast the experience of actually being in the presence? You contrast the experience of being in the presence of somebody, you were just talking about it, as opposed to talking to them on Skype, where you're almost in the presence, and it's a hell of a lot more in the presence than when you're on the phone.
Wow. You know the concept of the uncanny valley? Ever heard of that? I love the uncanny valley. It's my favorite idea. It's a concept in robotics. And it's the idea that if you make a robot look too human, then it's just deeply creepy, right? You think of all the horror movies you've seen where the dolls start moving, and you're just, oh my God, get me out of here. The uncanny valley is this idea that you must not must not make, I don't know, anyway, I don't remember exactly how to literalize that metaphor, but it's the idea that if things are too like life, they're creepy, right? And in a way, as you were talking, I was just thinking Skype is like the uncanny valley, because they're there, but they're not there, right? Whereas with the telephone, we're dealing with one element of their presence, right? But now you're dealing with their voice, their image, their background. Maybe it's too real, and it's not real enough, so it's disturbing.
The last question is, do we understate the speed at which time takes place? Do we fail to sort of realize how quickly 20 years from now will sort of emerge?
I mean, I think time gets faster as you get older. But I was thinking about, did you read, anyone here read Michael Lewis's Flash Boys? So, when you think about what is high frequency trading all about? It's about, millionths of a second, right? These transactions that are profits that are getting made in millionths of a second, and that's what these flash boys, these high frequency traders, were slicing and dicing and competing over, was over a millionth of a second. So I mean, I do think that as with computing, we are reaching a point where, as with knowledge, with complexity of information, right, that only computers can process. We are almost losing the ability to understand the time in which things happen. So I think time is, it's not necessarily speeding up, but it's getting ever more finely sliced. And you cannot experience things in 1/millionth of a second. Only a computer can, right? You can't even grasp it. You can't process that information. But in that time frame, so-and-so has just made $1 million. Or someone's computer has just made $1 million for them. So if you ask, do we understand how fast time is going? I would say in a literal, rigorous sense, no.
Does time really matter anymore? I mean, a 24/7, 365 world, international business, people around the world Skyping from Berlin to New York. Is time really that much of an issue anymore? I think in my kids' generations, their 20s and 30s, time to them doesn't really matter.
I'll tell you when time will start to matter to them, and this is why time does matter.
Time is a larger part of their life.
When they have children. Now, I'm not saying that just, no, I'm saying, so there's been a series of articles in the Times that I think are fantastic, in which they're talking about the effect of on-call shift on parents and on children, right? There's been a bunch of stuff on that. So as work schedules become discombobulated, as fewer and fewer people are working the standard 9 to 5 shift, who gets stuck with these they're called non-standard work schedules, and there's like a whole body of work on them, which I read for this book. Who gets stuck with that? The poor and the socially marginalized. Women. Okay, if you are, particularly if you're raising a family, right? It's really, really hard to deal with school and the schedules of daycare centers if you are on a night shift, right? So, or worse, where it's changing. Those unclub. What is there's a wonderful word that Jody, clopening. When you have to work at a Starbucks and you have to be there for the clopening, the close and the opening. So and you never know from week to week what your schedule is going to look like. Imagine dealing with those schedules, right? And how to juggle daycare or childcare. It's not necessarily daycare, childcare, and your marriage, and the schooling. And just the fact that children are operate on a different, there's a historian who, I quote, who calls it pre-industrial time. Children are on pre-industrial time, right? And we are on post-industrial time, which is global, right? Might be pegged to Japan, and might be pegged to some company that's doing just-in-time manufacturing. And I think that's when time really matters. And time also matters because time is, as Michael Lewis showed us, time is money. So I don't know if I would agree, and you probably would argue from a much more subjective and subjunctive point of view.
Which I'm not, because we've run out of time.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you.